I'm not only going to talk about the future of the image. In fact, I'm not really. I'm going to talk a little bit about some terms in the essay on Godard, the sentence image essay. But really, I'm going to talk about other texts, and particularly the political writings. And I hope that's going to be useful and kind of will open the discussion out a bit. I know you've been focused on on the Emancipated Spectator and the future of the image very closely, but I hope that by bringing in some of the kind of the other work on politics, that will help to kind of ventilate the discussion a bit and will be interesting rather than sort of frustrating. There are on the slides, there are some quite long quotations. So I wanted then to start by just saying something about this word in the title, parataxis, because it is not at all obvious what it is. And it comes from rhetoric, it comes from the analysis of written language, and it essentially means juxtaposition, putting one thing next to another. And in classical rhetoric, in the analysis of sentences, it's opposed to hypotaxis, which is the idea of subordination or coordination within a sentence. And I've given you two quite silly examples of what this of parataxis and hypotaxis with a similar kind of linguistic unit there at the bottom. So an example of parataxis, putting things alongside each other. Croydon, which is a small suburban town in England. Croydon, town of my misery, seat of my shame, abandoned by all those who dare hope. This is parataxis, one element aligned against, juxtaposed against each other. Although Croydon was the town of my misery and the seat of my shame, all those who dare hope abandon it. So there we have the although, which is hypotactic, introduces a coordination within the sentence. Now, so that first example of putting one element against one another is the sense in which I mean parataxis in the sentence. Rancière talks in the essay on Godard, in the future of the image, on different kinds of parataxis, but he's using the term in a way which already presupposes that people know what parataxis means, and not everybody does know what parataxis means. Okay, so I'm going to start with three quotations. These are all from Rancière, and they say something about his method. My philosophical work is largely located on the side of the unteachable, a way of moving about between the texts of philosophy, those of the worker archive, and those of literature, and of drawing conclusions. I've always worked on the margins by gathering up snippets, des bribes, snippets, that which falls by the wayside, des chutes, with the notion that what defines the conditions of thought and writing is never the time or situation as they are described by the dominant discourse. There is a sensible texture of experience which has to be recovered and which can only be rediscovered by entirely eliminating hierarchies between levels of knowledge of the political, the social, the intellectual, and the popular. The last quotation, it could nevertheless be said, he writes, it could nevertheless be said that the reading of Goni or of Jacotot has been more important for me than that of Heidegger or Lacan. Now, those three quotations are all taken from this extended book-length interview with Rancière that has so far only appeared in French. The Method of Equality, it's entitled, and I think it's a key part of Rancière's it's a kind of intellectual autobiography, I think, this text, a mediated autobiography. And they all say something different, those three quotations, about Rancière's approach, and I'm going to review them again. So this first quotation then, this idea of the unteachable quality of his work, what I've also called elsewhere its intractability. It has a kind of internal resistance to being treated, to being discussed, also to being, as it were, cured or remedied of its singularity by the classificatory understanding of conceptual treatment. In that sense, one can think of it as, in a certain way, analogous to the work of art, in the demand that it be approached on its own terms. This quotation also signals that he conceives of his own work as a way of moving between texts, une façon de circuler entre, a way of moving between different kinds of text from the worker archive and text from philosophy. So we have a conception of philosophy that's a bit reminiscent of the ancient Athenian idea of perambulatory practice. It's also reminiscent, for those of you who know the work of the French Situationists, it's also a little bit reminiscent of the dérive there. So in this second quotation, we have Rancière characterizing himself almost as a chiffonnier, as a rag and bone man, like Benjamin's. He picks up fragments which fall by the wayside, des bribes. Now, des bribes in French, that is, you'll see on the second line there, it's an interesting word, fragments or the figurative fragments of a conversation. Now, des chutes, des bribes, fragments of a conversation, but also etymologically, it was referred to the food that was given to the poor in order to placate them. Okay, so it's charitable donations to the poor. So if he's interested then, Rancière, in des bribes et des chutes, he's interested in the fragments of knowledge that had been intended for the poor in order to placate them and to keep them in their place. And this third quotation, I think, tells us something important about Rancière's distance from, his very calculated distance from established points of reference within, let's say, continental philosophy. So here we have Gauny, Louis-Gabriel Gauny, a worker poet of the 19th century, and Jacotot, Joseph Jacotot, the ignorant schoolmaster about whom I'm going to say more in a moment. But these are not shared points of reference. This is a kind of self-isolating project in that sense, in its relation to the established canon of references. I think that would prompt us to ask the question, this third slide, what it might be like to follow, not to follow Rancière. You've been spending a lot of time these 2 weeks reading Rancière, but what it would be like not to follow Rancière, but to do something a bit like what Rancière does in relation to Gauny and Jacotot, as opposed to following Heidegger or following Lacan, which is what, in a certain sense, others were doing at the time. So what it would be like to follow an unknown path, a path not already laid out by established references. So I want to say something about his egalitarian politics. I want to start with Joseph Jacotot, born in 1770, who you see on the slide. And Jacotot is Rancière's anti-teacher, if you like, the so-called ignorant schoolmaster referred to in his book of that title from 1987. Jacotot is not ignorant in the colloquial sense of stupid, quite the reverse. In fact, all that he's got is his intelligence. Rather, Jacotot is ignorant in the French sense of not knowing, of not possessing knowledge of the subject matter to pass on to his students. Jacotot had been successful in the 1790s, in the early days of the new French Republic, and this meant that he had, during the Restoration in 1815, to flee abroad. So Jacotot found himself at Leuven University, working as a teacher of French literature. Jacotot spoke no Flemish, and his students spoke no French. So he was unable to teach them anything in the normal way. And the normal way for Rancière, for Jacotot, is by explaining something. So he couldn't explain because he didn't have a common language, so he had to find another way of teaching. So in the founding experiment of Jacotot's in the book, he gave the students copies of a recently published bilingual edition, a parallel text edition of Fénelon's book Télémaque, and got them to recite its opening lines. And when they got to the middle of the book, he made them start all over again at the beginning. He then asked them to write in French about what they'd read, and he was astonished to find that they could. And he hadn't explained anything to them. So Rancière's commentary on this exercise is as follows. To explain something to someone is first of all to show him he cannot understand it by himself. I'm sorry, and the gendered pronouns are in the translation. Before being the act of the pedagogue, explication is the myth of pedagogy, the parable of a world divided into knowing minds and ignorant ones, ripe minds and immature ones, the capable and the incapable, the intelligent and the stupid. Better results could be achieved, Rancière and Jacques suggest, by presuming from the outset the equality of the intelligence of student and teacher. And as the book advances, we see Jacques radicalize his experiment by teaching subjects about which he knew nothing. So he teaches piano playing without knowing how to play the piano, for example. He teaches painting without knowing how to paint, he says. So what is his role as a teacher, you might ask, if he doesn't know about the subjects that he's talking about? Well, it became that of a relentless questioning. So he is a questioner. The sole function of that questioning of the student was to seek to check that the student had applied himself or herself to the task fully. So the teacher's function in the learning encounter, in which the equality of intelligence has been presumed from the outset, is to check the quality of the students attending, the quality of their attention. It's not to check the knowledge that the student has, because the teacher doesn't have the knowledge to check that knowledge. The learning encounter, so, is stripped back then by Rancière to its most fundamental dimension, a disciplining or a self-disciplining of human attentiveness. So the emancipating teacher is enjoined by Jacques to be intraitable, to be an intractable master. So when faced with protests from the student that they can't play the piano, they can't paint, they can't speak whichever language he's trying to teach them, he has to be intractable. In other words, he has to be to show no apparent sympathy. This is a quotation that I like to reproduce. So faced with a student who says, I can't do this, I can't paint. In this example, it's, I can't recite these lines of Télémaque from this parallel text edition. Jacques will say, you must begin to speak. Don't say that you can't. You know how to say I can't. Say in its place, Calypso could not, the first line of Télémaque. And you're off. You're off on a route that you already knew, that you knew you should follow without giving up, and that you should follow without giving up. Don't say I can't, or then learn to say it. Learn to say I can't in the manner of Calypso, in the manner of Telemachus, of Narbala, of Idomeneus, characters from the book. You will never run out of ways of saying I can't, and soon you will be able to say everything. So it's a conversion of incapacity into performance, premised on this notion of intellectual equality, and also premised on the lack of sympathy for that impossibility on the part of the teacher. Okay, so that's something about the pedagogy. What's that got to do with Parataxis, and what's that got to do with politics? Well, that's a very good question, which I'll ask myself. So in Jacques egalitarian classroom, as dramatized by Rancière, we've got what could be described as a political pedagogy of Parataxis. So the figure of the para, of this Greek root in Parataxis, that which is alongside, is present in the parallel text. So this edition, this parallel text edition of Télémaque is a facing text edition. So we have the figure of the para, and we have the brute co-presence in the teaching room of students alongside this particular kind of master. So there's the presence para alongside the master, and teaching takes place in that classroom, not on a vertical plane in which explanations are handed down from teacher to student, but along a horizontal plane in which the master simply checks the quality of the student's attentiveness to the writing. Rancière's suspicion of more ordinary pedagogy dates back at least to his polemical book, Althusser's Lesson. Louis Althusser, as you may have already said this week, was Rancière's teacher, one of his teachers at the École Normale Supérieure. And La Leçon d'Althusser, Althusser's Lesson in 1974, is a very public repudiation, a rejection of Althusser and his teaching. So it's a turning of the student on the master in a very public way. So Rancière had studied alongside Althusser, or under Althusser, I think we might more accurately say, at the École Normale in the preceding decade, producing notably so Rancière's contribution to this collective volume, Reading Capital, Lire le Capital from 1965, was included in that first edition by Althusser, who's repaid with this very public kind of rejection. The terms of that rejection are interesting. So Rancière thought that Althusser's insistence on the idea of Marxist science as a discipline was a kind of circuitous plea for the authority of the philosopher-interpreter. So Althusser had claimed to free Marx's, the text of Karl Marx, from the authority of the French Communist Party. But Rancière, so Althusser's notion was that philosophers should read Marx and could be authoritative in interpreting Marx, as opposed to the French Communist Party as the kind of legitimate interpreter of that work. Rancière will say in La Leçon d'Althusser that he'd freed this text from the authority of the Communist Party only to claim that authority for himself. So in other words, Althusser's is an authoritarian pedagogical project. And in The Philosopher and His Poor, so this is a brief review of the political writings, in The Philosopher and His Poor, published in French in 1983, Rancière would go on to voice very similar criticisms of other teaching intellectuals and teachers on the left. So he will voice very similar criticisms of Pierre Bourdieu, of Jean-Paul Sartre, and indeed of Marx himself, all of whom he sees as having a scandalous affinity with Plato in the sense that they all craved a kind of power for the philosopher, a kind of influence over public policy, particularly in the case of Bourdieu, which marks them out as a kind of as a power-hungry figure, as power-hungry figures invested in a caste-style division of social labour. So the political implications of Rancière's pedagogical egalitarianism are spelled out in his two most substantial political books, which are On the Shores of Politics, Au bord du politique, and Disagreement, La Mésentente. So I've spoken already about the presumption, the verification of equality in the pedagogical encounter, but what we also learn in these books is that the declaration of a presumed equality plays a crucial role in emancipatory political struggle. So these books, one of the things they do is they retell stories. They retell stories of uprising. And one of the uprisings on which they focus very particularly is the Aventine secession in ancient Rome around 500 BC. So this story of this is a story of popular uprising, and Rancière will tell this in both Disagreement, retell this in both Disagreement and On the Shores of Politics. And he is interested in two versions of the story. So there are two versions of the story. There's a version by the Roman historian Livy, which is very standard issue history, if you like. And then there is a version by the worker intellectual Pierre-Simon Ballanche from the 1830s, who reveals something about the story that Livy, in his official history, concealed. So the plebs, I will retell the kind of the bare bones, then I will try to say what Rancière says about this, this event. So the plebs, the common people of Rome, withdrew from the city of Rome to the Aventine Hill, alongside Rome. And it was a kind of precursor of a general strike. So they were withdrawing their labour from the city of Rome. And this withdrawal was in protest at the concentration of power in the hands of the patricians who ruled Rome. The patricians sent an emissary to the plebs on the Aventine Hill who told them an allegorical story in which Rome was likened to the human body, the city of Rome to the human body, which had limbs, and the limbs were the plebs, and it had a stomach, the patricians. The limbs thought that the stomach was being nourished at their expense, so they stopped feeding it. This was the story, but in turn, they became weak. Now, in Ballanche's retelling of this story from the 1830s, what interests Rancière is the criticism of Livy for failing to see this as anything other than a show of force by the plebs. For Ballanche, by contrast, this is a struggle which bears on the very existence of the plebs as a political entity in their own right. Livy's telling of the story is from the perspective of the patricians. This is what Ballanche indicates, and this is what Rancière picks up from Ballanche's retelling. So Livy's is an official history. It is a telling of the story of the strike from the perspective of the patricians, and for the patricians, the plebs were subservient animal-like beings who could be lured back to Rome, back to productive labour, by a seductive allegorical tale. Now, in his retelling, Ballanche makes much of how the plebs not only withdrew their labour, but that they also, on the Aventine Hill, established their own systems of government, their own oracles, to use the language of the time, and their own representatives. And when they return to the city of Rome, so it's not just just an expression of force. There is also a degree of self-governance by the plebs. And when they return to Rome, it's only after having extracted from the patricians a new contractual agreement about their function and their existence as a political entity. The plebs, Rancière insists, then, in the story of the Aventine secession, the plebs presume their own equality with those who govern them. They presume their own equality with those who govern them. They withdraw from the city. They therefore create the stage, the scene of the demonstration of their own equality. And they come into existence as a political subject in Rome as a result of that demonstration. Now, this is a particularly, this is an example that Rancière will return to on several occasions. And out of it, and a series of other incidents like it, of uprising, he will develop his theory of egalitarian or democratic politics. And I think I want to leave the detail of this account to one side in the main, except to say that there is an aesthetic dimension to the coming into being of the political subject. An aesthetic dimension in the sense of, not in the sense of a dimension as to do with art, but in the Baumgartian, I know you've talked about Baumgarten, but in the Baumgartian sense of to do with the sensory and the senses. So when the plebs on the Aventine, so before the plebs withdraw to the Aventine Hill, they are not perceived as political subjects. They are perceived, in the full sense of perceived, as almost as animals. So they provide their productive labour, that labour is exploited, and it benefits the patricians. They have no existence as a political subject. They are more like animals, beasts of burden, than they are political subjects. And there is a perceptual element to that status. So what they effect when they withdraw their own labour is in a sense their humanization as political subjects. So there is a perceptual and aesthetic element to that self-transformative process. And this leads into the conception of le partage du sensible, the division or distribution of the sensible. And it's Rancière's most concise way of naming. It's a kind of formula for naming the interconnectedness of the political and the aesthetic, which emerges out of stories like that of the Aventine secession. The distribution of the sensible. So, and you've got the kind of, insofar as there is a kind of key quotation for the distribution of the sensible, it's from that text, The Politics of Aesthetics, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more later on. But speech and noise here is a reference to the division between meaning-bearing political language, which is the preserve of counted, recognized members of the city-state, and the brutish noise, which is produced by as it were, by subjects who are not yet political subjects. So when the plebs complain about the conditions of their labour initially, before withdrawing to the Aventine Hill, their speech is heard by the patricians as animal-like noises. So it's as though what the patricians can hear, and it is in a strong sense hear, when the plebs complain about the conditions of their labour, it's as though these were animals complaining under the burden that they have to animals complaining under the yoke. What happens when they become political subjects is they accede to a kind of speech which is heard as political language. We can come back to that, but I think I want to just kind of give you I'm not going to talk about all of these, but so after disagreement in 1995. Rancière really moves on to work only on art and aesthetics. And these are all of the books that he's published on art and aesthetics since 1995. So you can see in more or less, and the date of publication is the date of publication in French. Les Écarts du Cinéma hasn't been translated yet. You can see that the future of the image, you can see where the future of the image and the Emancipated Spectator fit into that list. And the most recent book was only published earlier this year. So, Le fil perdu, essai sur la fiction moderne, The Lost Thread, it contains essays on Virginia Woolf and others, and that was only published earlier this year. The major book goes over a lot of the work that he's done in earlier books, because he has a way of writing whereby he will write and then rewrite on the same themes in a more extended way in later texts, is really aesthesis, the scenes from the aesthetic regime of art. That is the kind of summation of the aesthetics. In saying that, I don't think it's a better text or a text that should have been studied. I think in a way that you see in the future of the image some of the concepts coming into being in a way that is more interesting than seeing them in their finished form in aesthesis. Common to much of Rancière's writing on aesthetics is his conceptual framework of the three regimes of art: ethical, representational, and aesthetic. These are not purely or straightforwardly historical, even if it is the case that the aesthetic regime only really emerges at the end of the 18th century in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, and notably in Kant's theorization of aesthetic experience as something which is a universal human possibility regardless of social rank or status. The regimes of art describe ways of looking at artworks and understanding their relationship to the wider society. In the ethical regime, we are concerned with the effect of the work on the ethos or way of being of individuals and the community. So examples of practices which are apprehended under the ethical regime would include dance as therapeutic technique, for example, theatre as civic festival, and much of the art appreciated by John Ruskin and made by William Morris would also fall under the category of the ethical regime. The representational regime of art is governed by Aristotle's principle of mimesis, and the primary function of mimesis, Rancière will note, is to set apart certain social practices and allow their products to be apprehended as art rather than in instrumental terms. So they are copies or imitations, artworks in the representational regime, which means they require their own standards of judgment. They can't be judged as one would judge ordinary objects. That's what mimesis principally means, Rancière suggests. And the representational regime, and this is the key thing about it for Rancière, is that it is intrinsically hierarchical. And its most basic demand is that the representation, for example, by way of its genre or language, be appropriate, be matched appropriately to the position in the social hierarchy of the represented subject. So to sum this up, as Rancière will do on several occasions, kings must talk as though they were kings, servants as though they were servants. That's a kind of demand of the representational regime. In the aesthetic regime of art, there are no hierarchies of genre, and there's no demand for the work to be in any sense appropriate to its subject. And it's the only regime, the aesthetic regime, in which it makes sense to speak of art in the singular as opposed to the arts. In abandoning mimesis, the aesthetic regime abandons the criterion by which certain social practices were kept apart from pragmatic, instrumental, or ethical evaluation. So it follows that in the aesthetic regime of art, as opposed to the other two regimes, any object can potentially be an artwork. Any object can potentially be an artwork, which doesn't mean that every object is an artwork. It means any object can potentially be an artwork, and that there is no stable or generalizable demarcation between art practices and other social practices in the aesthetic regime. It's also worth noting that particular works, and we see this very clearly in film fables, particular artworks, particular films, for instance, can be caught between two of the regimes. So particular films can be caught between the aesthetic and the representational regime. So even a single work can be pulled between two of the regimes of art, which I think adds another dimension of complexity to the theorization. So Rancière's major book on aesthetics, the kind of summation book, Aesthesis from 2011, contains 14 scenes, 14 chapters from what he calls the aesthetic regime of art. So the regime of art which arose at the end of the 18th century from the collapse of the neo-Aristotelian representational paradigm. This collapse of the representational paradigm is most vividly expressed in the subject of the first scene, which is Winckelmann's, the German aesthetician's, Winckelmann's appreciation of a Greek statue of the torso of Hercules, the Belvedere torso. And the interesting thing about aesthesis, one of the interesting things about aesthesis is that each of the scenes begins with a short text. So we get a short quotation, rather like in Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, each chapter begins with a short quotation. In aesthesis, we have a short textual transcription of the artwork. So in the case of the first scene, we've got Winckelmann talking about the Belvedere torso. Now, in a very obvious way, this statue embodies the ruin of the representational regime. This is a limbless statue, which is an inappropriate representation of Hercules. Okay, the action hero of Greek mythology. It's limbless, it's headless, it's a mutilated, and therefore an inactive action hero. So in that sense, it embodies very clearly the ruin of the representational regime and its transition to the aesthetics, to the aesthetic regime. Okay, I will say a little bit about the 14th scene in aesthesis. So the 14th scene is given over to a text of a photo novel by the American journalist James Agee and Walker Evans, a text known as Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. That's the title of the book in English, published in 1941. So it's a book of text and photographs, and it documents the domestic environment of Alabama sharecroppers at the end of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So it's partly a piece of ethnographic reportage, political ethnographic reportage. So this is the last of the 14 scenes in Aesthesis. In this 14th scene, it becomes very clear what the overall stakes of this intellectual project are, I think. So he returns to lock swords again with Clement Greenberg, and Greenberg is a common reference, as you'll know. He will lock swords specifically with Greenberg's account of modernism. And this is Greenberg's, the classic kind of Greenbergian statement of what modernism is. So the idea of the artist turning away from common experience onto the medium of his own craft, and the idea of the abstract or the non-representational being a working on the means of the art form and the medium. So Rancière's counter-history of modernism, and he describes Aesthesis as a counter-history of aesthetic modernity, intends then to overturn both of the premises in Greenberg's formulation. So to overturn, first of all, the idea that there is a distinctive medium and techniques proper to each art form, to each artist's own craft, and also to overturn the notion that there is an inevitable tendency towards abstraction, insofar as abstraction is understood as each art form's turning away from the world of extroverted experience onto its own medium and processes. So moving in the opposite direction from the analysis of modernism advanced by Greenberg, Rancière characterizes the aesthetic regime of art in terms of a tendency towards the erasure, or at least the blurring, of the divisions between each art form, between the boundaries between different art forms, and the boundaries between art and life. But there is a question, I think, why this difference of opinion? It's clear that Rancière has a difference of opinion with Greenberg about what modernism is, why it matters, and why it matters politically. So one of the things that Greenberg will do is very famously to try to distinguish art from kitsch. Kitsch being a kind of degenerate form which the vast majority of ordinary people who have no time to learn about art, to appreciate art proper, that's all they have. All they have is kitsch, because they don't have time for art proper. And in the famous essay by Greenberg that you probably know, he will explain the distinction between kitsch and art proper in this way. And he borrows a kind of illustrative figure of an ignorant Russian peasant, as he calls this person, to make the point about the distinction between art and kitsch. Things being as they are in Russia and everywhere else, the peasant soon finds the necessity of working hard all day for his living, and the rude, uncomfortable circumstances in which he lives do not allow him enough leisure, energy, and comfort to train for the enjoyment of Picasso. So in Greenberg's assertion that this imaginary peasant has no time to train for the appreciation of art, we find the same premise that Rancière set out to challenge in Proletarian Nights and The Philosopher and His Poor. In other words, to presume that somebody has no time to appreciate art because of their dominated position within an inequitable social division of labour is effectively to endorse, rather than to challenge, that inequitable division of social labour. In the language of the ignorant schoolmaster, it's to presuppose inequality and to set about verifying inequality. Now, as a Marxist, Greenberg himself looked forward to the moment of revolution as the time in which the true equality would come to pass. In other words, the time at which the peasant would have the time to train for the enjoyment of Picasso. But Rancière's suggestion is that if art is envisaged as Greenberg envisages it, and it's not just Greenberg, so he thinks that Greenberg's conception of what art is the dominant conception of what art and modernism are. But if art's envisaged in that way, Rancière suggests, then that legitimizes an unequally divided society which is partitioned into those who have time to be concerned with the difficulty of art proper, and the rest who are presumed to have time only for its degenerate ersatz, for kitsch. Now, if Greenberg had been asked about the figure of the ignorant peasant, he would probably have responded that he was merely attempting to be realistic about people's capacities under existing conditions of social inequality, and that having no time is a contingent and, moreover, a pardonable matter. Yet for Rancière, such realism or pragmatism is neither innocent nor neutral. It's a pessimism that tacitly reasserts the authoritarian Platonic injunction, according to which the worker can do nothing but work and must therefore leave art and politics to those of a superior class who have the requisite leisure and expertise to engage in those activities. So it's not just that Greenberg's view of art is elitist. In a way, it's obvious that it's elitist. The point that Rancière is making is that Greenberg's conception of modernism presupposes and therefore reinforces socially the inequities of certain established social hierarchies. So if art is destined to be the privileged concern of an urban elite of specialists who turn inward on their own practices, then this has social and political, as well as more narrowly aesthetic or artistic implications. So to hold to a Greenbergian conception of modernism has consequences which extend far beyond the particular artworks that are produced. Over time, that kind of conception of what art is entrenches social stratification, because the propensity of the workers towards kitsch, which is originally explained as a contingent matter of their having no time, is gradually naturalized into an identity or social essence. Neither Rancière nor Agee are trying to rehabilitate kitsch or to suggest that kitsch is interchangeable with high art. Rancière wouldn't have any sympathy for that kind of for postmodern project. So what is Rancière trying to do, and what is Agee trying to do? Agee mentions the kitsch in the Alabama sharecroppers' houses as part of his ethnographic work on his ethnographic writing of their houses. So he mentions the kitsch, but he saves his most concentrated attention, and indeed his lyricism, for other features of the domestic environment. So Agee will be lyrical about the partition wall in one of the family's front bedrooms. He will say that that wall is, importantly, among other things, a great tragic poem. He will write about the beauty of the garments which have been, the clothes which have been repaired so many times that nothing of the original garment remains. Now, Rancière writes then of the aesthetic beauty accomplished here in exemplary fashion in Agee's descriptions, which draw on Agee's own acquaintance with aesthetic culture as a spectator from elsewhere, with in his head and eyes the memory of other works that he has seen. In discerning the truth of a world in a utensil or a fabric, Agee's approach is very similar to Proust's, to Marcel Proust's, Rancière suggests. Yet Agee also marks the injustice of a social division, the partage of roles and identities, which means that those who live in this environment do not see its beauty. And this is from James Agee's book. To those who own and create it, this is the beauty that Agee is discerning in the partition wall or the garments. This beauty is, however, irrelevant and undiscernible. It is best discernible to those who, by economic advantages of training, have only a shameful and thief's right to it, and it might be said that they have any rights whatever only in proportion as they recognize the ugliness and disgrace implicit in their privilege of perception. The usual solution, non-perception or apologetic perception, or contempt for those who perceive and value it, seems to me at least unwise. In fact, it seems to me necessary to insist that the beauty of a house, inextricably shaped as it is in an economic and human abomination, is at least as important a part of the fact as that abomination itself. So we have here, in Agee's description of these Alabama sharecroppers at the end of the Great Depression, we have here people who are unable to see the beauty of their own surroundings. They're unable to see that beauty because of their situation of economic impoverishment or domination. Instead, in a very meagre exchange for everything that has been taken from them, by virtue of their social position, it is their lot to know merely the shadow of the beauty of others. Okay, the kitsch of the photographs and calendars that they spread on their walls. So all they get back is kitsch. But that inability is understood by Agee and also by Rancière to be part and parcel of their lot, their share or part, to be bound up with the social violence that's been done to them. In other words, it's a contingent inability which is closely related but not reducible to their economic impoverishment. So they're unable to see the beauty of their own surroundings, not in absolute terms, but they're unable purely because that ability has been stolen from them by the inequitable distribution of goods, which is another way of describing their situation of domination. Hence, Agee's reference to the theft by the elite of the capacity to discern this beauty. So, while both Rancière and Greenberg notice the same contingent inability, there is a difference. In Greenbergian modernism, if I can put it this way, the thieves get to keep what they've stolen with a clear conscience. So the sharecroppers cannot see the poetry of their own garments as Agee can because they lack his prior exposure to the accumulated riches of aesthetic culture. They do not have the memory of countless performances and pages in their head as Agee does. Their senses lack his training in, which is to say purely and simply his reflective acquaintance with, the great works of aesthetic high culture. What Agee's book strives to do, Rancière concludes, is to overturn the play of relationships between the art of the poor, elite culture, and the rubbish which the latter export onto the territory of the former. It's that dispiriting game or play of relationships between different parts of an unjustly partitioned shared social reality which Agee has discerned and strives to resist. Not by seeking to offer up these sharecroppers to the documentary gaze of an urban elite, for a voyeuristic gaze, but rather by weaving their lives, their environments, and their clothes into the shared common fabric of aesthetic experience, into the aesthetic regime, indeed. So the difference between Rancière and Greenberg lies then in their view of the remedy. In other words, what to do next about the contingent inability on the part of these farmers to appreciate their own surroundings aesthetically. Greenbergian modernism, in other words, modernism as it's generally conceived, art as it's generally conceived, that conception is content to withdraw into itself and abandon these farmers. For the farmers, one could take other dominated subjects, but to abandon these farmers to the kitsch, which is also the marker of the poverty of their lives. Rancière senses that such an abandonment is one form which the naturalization of the contingency of having no time takes. Such abandonment, which is implicit in a Greenbergian conception of art's meaning and destiny, reinforces the inequality of the social partage du sensible, which has left these farmers sans part. If James Agee had shared Greenberg's disposition or view of art, he might never have gone to Alabama at all to look at these houses, and if he'd gone, he might have turned in precisely the kind of voyeuristic reportage which the magazine that commissioned him Fortune magazine initially expected. It would be fair to say that A.G., not unlike Jacques Cousteau, emerges as a heroic figure in Rancière's own reprise of his work. He is, in a certain sense, saved by Rancière from the disregard of others. Sorry, the quotations are getting longer. This is a quotation from an interview that Rancière did with me for a book that came out last year. And he's talking here about this 14th scene, and he's kind of re-explaining it. So I just wanted to draw it to your attention. It makes sense to show how that which became the dominant modernist paradigm, the Greenbergian theorization, is in fact a liquidation of the dominant tendency of the aesthetic regime, which is to abolish the boundaries between mediums, between high art and popular art, and ultimately between art and life. So the aesthetic regime tends to abolish those boundaries. Greenberg wants to work in the other direction. It's a kind of Greenberg is a kind of counter-revolutionary figure almost. All of a sudden, I was stopped short by A.G.'s very violent response to a survey from Partisan Review on trends in American literature. It appeared very clearly that this survey was the American Marxist intelligentsia's attempt to settle scores with the Whitmanian tradition, and that this was the context in which the meaning of Greenberg's intervention had to be understood. To be done with that tradition of mixing, which had in fact constituted the essential axis of the modernist dream, from Emerson and Whitman to Meyerhold and Vertov. Greenberg does not only say that we must do away with that model, he says, roughly speaking, the death of culture and of high art happens when the sons of daughters of peasants take up leisure activities and want culture. In fact, he dismisses the entire perceptible, this is Greenberg, dismisses the entire perceptible logic of redistribution underpinning the aesthetic regime. Now, what Rancière states very plainly here, albeit in passing, at the end of the section, is that the aesthetic regime of art contains a logic of redistribution between rich and poor, which it's vital that art remains attuned to. And that demand for redistribution is intractable or non-negotiable. One of the things that's wrong with Greenberg's conception and other conceptions like it is that they try to do away with that logic of redistribution, that demand for redistribution. The other thing to say, though, is that this isn't simply a conversion of art into politics. This isn't a conversion of art into politics, because Rancière will insist that art must also be intractable as art and not collapse into a veiled politics. So to the extent that art of the aesthetic regime dispels the neo-Aristotelian idea of the appropriateness or fitness of individuals and their actions to their social position and destiny, it's consistent with the era of democratic politics. So to the extent that art of the aesthetic regime dispels the neo-Aristotelian idea of the appropriateness or fitness of individuals and their actions to their social position, it is consistent with the era of democratic politics. Okay, so the notion under the Aristotelian regime that kings must talk like kings, servants must talk like servants, and that one hierarchizes works of art according to whether they are starring those kinds of character, that passes away, and so that passing away is consistent with the era of democratic politics, although not equivalent to democratic politics. So we can understand the representational regime as the regime structured around relations of appropriateness, conceived as requiring acts of ordering and subordination, procedures of hypotaxis, to give these their name in rhetoric. So the aesthetic regime, by contrast, can be characterized as the regime of parataxis, or of non-hierarchized juxtaposition. I think what I want to do to finish is, in fact, to say something from a little bit about how the regimes of art are also regimes of governance. And I want to do that by... So this is from the prologue of this most recent book on aesthetics, on modernist or modern fiction, to use Virginia Woolf's term, which he does. And this brings out, I think, quite clearly how it is that the regimes of art relate to governance. So we've known since Aristotle that fiction is not the invention of imaginary worlds. It's first of all a structure of rationality, a mode of presentation, which makes things, situations, and events perceptible and intelligible. A way of linking which constructs forms of coexistence, succession, and causal sequence between events, and gives these forms the characteristics of the possible, the real, or the necessary. Yet this double operating is required wherever it is a case of constructing a certain sense of reality and of fashioning its intelligibility. Political action which names subjects, identifies situations, links events, and deduces from this what is possible and impossible, makes use of fictions as novelists or filmmakers do. Sorry, this is the last of the long quotations. But the Aristotelian rules of fiction underwrite the principles from which is derived the authority of politically realistic action, social science, and mediatized communication. And disturbances of the fictional order conversely allow new relationships to be thought between words and things, between perceptions and actions, between repetitions of the past and projections of the future, between the meaning of the real and the possible, of the necessary and the plausible, from all of which are woven the forms of social experience and political subjectivation. What we normally call politics these days, which is to say party politics, the entity that's reported on the news when people talk about politics, it's what most people mean by politics, we could say is mainly structured according to the neo-Aristotelian principles of the representational regime. I think one of the interesting things about where Rancière's project is going now is to say the kind of stories that are put out by political parties, by individuals. We talk a lot these days about individuals having a story, there being a narrative of a particular event, and a lot of what happens under the guise of what we call politics is the competition between different stories of events. Now, I think it follows from these two quotations particularly, but the general direction of Rancière's work, that sphere of ordinary politics is a sphere structured like the Aristotelian representational regime. So the question then would be what the kind of political question in the fuller sense of what politics is, so not just party politics, but in the fuller sense of what politics would be, how one would bring about an aesthetic disruption of those principles. And these are principles for organising and telling stories. What about Parataxis in all of this? What about Rancière's writing project? It is a writing project in relation to those questions. So writing, the process of writing, is a paratactic process in the sense that it allows people, ideas, objects, places to be situated alongside one another in the text that would never meet or encounter or touch upon one another in real life. So elements that would never have been juxtaposed may be accumulated or arranged without being hierarchized. So in other words, there may be, in the space of writing, a paratactic juxtaposition. And writing is paratactic also in the sense that it allows those elements to touch and be touched by one another. Undermines spatially, socially instantiated divisions, which social orders erect to keep the poor in their place. Writing works against those kinds of divisions. But it's easy to overlook the fact that Rancière is writing the aesthetic. He is a writer of the aesthetic. And this is especially clear in aesthesis, because, as I've said, each of the scenes begins with a fragment of writing. It's not Rancière's writing, it's a fragment of somebody else writing about an artwork. But it draws our attention to the fact that Rancière's own project is a writing project. And that writing of art makes the elements of art democratically available for everyone in a common sensorium of coexistence. That common sensorium of aesthesis, which in turn encourages the reader to recombine those elements in their own sequential act of reading. An act of reading that can be envisaged as a kind of artistic remaking. That in turn opens the door to two more radical propositions, namely that every man can be an artist, not is, but can be, and that anything can be art, these possibilities that lie in the aesthetic regime. It opens the door to a possibility of the reorganization of the community around new works and forms of perception and intelligibility, which in turn would allow for the emergence of new political subjects and hitherto unimagined kinds of sharing, and for a new sense of what is possible. And just to conclude, Rancière speaks in the future of the image, in that essay, of the work of art as a paratactic syntax, in other words, a syntax of juxtaposition, a syntax which traces a very delicate aesthetic and political line between a terrifying and anarchic multiplicity of disconnected singularities in non-hierarchized juxtaposition, and the totalitarian horror on the other side of an entirely stratified and unified community of consensus. Thank you.